Hi there. Welcome to Economics from the South, where we rethink economics, give a voice to marginalized communities, and come up with lasting solutions to ensure a fairer, more sustainable future for all of us. I'm your host, Julian Samboko, a Kenyan business journalist. This series is brought to you by the International Development Economics Associates, a network of economists who challenge the way the world is run and put forward viable alternatives that center the perspectives and needs of the global south. We're focusing on two really important research areas for ideas: the international debt crisis and the global financial architecture. Episode 2. In March this year, that's 2024, I went to a really insightful conference in Accra, Ghana, organized by Ideas on Africa Debt, where I met two economic giants, people who for decades have brought refreshing, compelling arguments to the table and made a real difference in policy. I'm delighted to be joined by...
I'm José Antonio Ocampo, now professor at Colombia University, but previously head of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean and the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And in my country, Colombia, Minister of Finance twice, and Minister of Agriculture and Minister of Planning.
I'm Kregel. I teach development finance at Tallinn Technological University in Tallinn, Estonia, and at the New School for Social Research in New York City.
This is not the first debt crisis we are talking about. There have been some in the past. What are some of the differences you see? If I could start with you, Ocampo.
Well, there have been many crises. I'm from Latin America, and we have had many crises. But this one, I think what is specific about Africa is that it's not official financing that is a major issue, or the only issue, but also private financing. Which was not true, let's say, of the crisis of the 1980s and the early 1990s, which was more official financing, although a few cases also private financing. I think that's a big difference. Latin America, the crisis of the 1980s was private financing. You can say the crisis of the 1930s was private financing. Yeah. And the current situation for countries that are difficulties is also private financing.
Okay. Your thoughts?
We can be even more extensive than that. I mean, if you go back to the 19th century, the U.S. states issued bonds, and they defaulted frequently on those bonds. J.P. Morgan ended up building his financial empire, selling bonds that defaulted. New York City very recently went to a substantial debt crisis. These are things which are endemic across not only states, but individual cities, and also nations. And now we're looking basically at nations. And the current crisis is one that has a little difference in terms of the kind of debt. Yeah. But the fact of having the crisis is a very common factor.
HIPIC, that's the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. It has been used to draw comparison with the current situation. What's the difference between that one and this one?
Well, again, is the nature of for sub-Saharan Africa, the nature of the solution, because the crisis of the 1990s or 1980s, 1990s, which was essentially with official financing, was essentially managed through the multilateral debt relief of 2005. I mean, there was the HIPIC initiative that you mentioned before, but I think the one that was very strong was the multilateral debt relief, because that included relief of multilateral financing, which is something that is not common and actually has not been discussed even today for the current crisis.
Multilateral financing is financing from the development finance institutions, the World Banks, the IMFs, and the rest. So there is a view that a lot of the debt resolution discussion right now, or the alleviation of debt distress conversation, focuses on placing the burden on the debtor countries and not so much on the creditors. Is that a view you share?
Well, if you look at a debt relationship, you've got a debtor and you have a creditor. And presumably, when these things take place, they're supposed to be voluntary. Now, in many cases, they're not. They're not for two reasons. One, the borrowing countries are faced with conditions in which they require support, and without borrowing, they're not able to support domestic programs, they're not able to support the domestic population. On the part of creditors, if they've already lent to a country and a country is in difficulty, they're faced with a problem. Either they have to cut off lending or they continue to lend in the hope that the country is going to recover. So you have incentives on both sides in the beginning in order to try and extend the debt as long as you possibly can. And eventually a point has to be reached where both the debtors and the creditors have to decide that it's no longer in their interest to do that. Now, for the creditor countries, it's a decision that, well, the debtor is probably never going to be able to meet the payments. And for the borrowing country, it's that the conditions of repayment are just much too onerous in order for political stability. And that's when you end up at a point of crisis.
Right now, the conversation globally is we need to have a framework for responsible borrowing and responsible lending. What would be your views on that?
As you said, we need responsible borrowing and responsible lending. Now, in the case of the lending part, one of the issues that is crucially the participation of private sector lenders, let's say both banks on the one hand, but also the owners of the bonds that have been issued by countries. But also in the case of official financing, one of the problems is that some of the official creditors don't want to reduce debts. So don't want, in the jargon of this debate, don't want haircuts. And unfortunately, China seems to be on board and also with higher interest rates for sub-Saharan African countries. Of course, lenders have to think when the capacity of countries to pay, but then when there's debt restructuring process, they have to participate actively in trying to find a solution.
Okay. But Professor John, let me ask you, 14 years ago, we had the principles of responsible lending drafted by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, that's UNCTAD. Since we seem to have already principles in place, why doesn't it seem to be really front and center right now?
Well, but this is basically the problem of any sort of debt contract. I mean, you don't make a debt contract expecting the borrower to default. And there are always going to be difficulties because you can't predict the future. And most of the difficulties that we have are in terms of disappointed expectations in terms of that lending. Now, part of this problem is political, because if you're lending to a nation may decide to change their policies. So if you're a lender and you're lending at a term which is longer than the normal election cycle in a country, you always have the risk that there's going to be a political change. So you can set up as many conditions as you want to do, but you can't bind the hands of the governments who are taking the loans. And neither can the lender impose on that borrower the conditions that started out with the loan. Now, that's simply in terms of a standard political process. Now, if we go beyond that, 20 years ago, we knew that there was an environmental crisis that was coming, but we presumed that there was going to be some sort of trend deterioration in the climate. And 2 or 3 years ago, you started to see a number of scientists saying, look, this is not a trend position any longer. It's something that has the potential to go very quickly. You're a lender, you're lending to a country, you take Ghana. Ghana has productions in terms of particular kinds of agricultural products, the historic one, which is gold, and also the fact of cocoa production, which in the beginning was considered to be a relatively poor commodity in terms of its ability to generate revenues, has now become very, very important. One of them is doing reasonably well right now in terms of its price, or in fact, both of them. But there's a distinct possibility that climate change could instantly eliminate the ability of the Ghanaian government to use those exports in order to pay debt service. And automatically you have a debt crisis, which neither side would have foreseen 10 or 15 years ago.
Professor Ocampo, the elephant in the room is about comparability of treatment. Creditors will wait one another out to see who will blink first, who is the one who will accept to take a lower amount than then it initially agreed, what you're calling the haircut. How big a problem is this?
The problem is very severe, actually, because first of all, the private creditors don't want to participate in the renegotiation process. That's a significant problem for sub-Saharan Africa. the multilateral debt relief or the multilateral institutions simply do not reduce debts, do not do haircuts. And then the official financing, which is generally the one that is more general, let's say, in the renegotiations, now also are fairly reluctant for haircuts, including China, which is a major lender. And then there is the problem of coordination. Because the solution has to be a common solution. And that's why there has to be a very specific ad hoc initiative to manage this problem, because otherwise there will be no solution.
Yeah. And I think just to add on to this, if you are a lender and there are a number of other lenders to the same borrower, really what you're not negotiating is how much is going to be paid back, but the distribution of what's going to be paid back amongst the various lenders. And this does encourage this business of trying to hold out to get the maximum possible relative to the other lenders. And that simply increases the difficulty in reaching a solution.
I want us to switch gears and talk about special drawing rights. First of all, for those of us who might not be familiar with that, what are SDRs or special drawing rights, and how do they come into this conversation around debt distress and the resolution?
Well, the special drawing rights is like, let's call it the money that is issued by the International Monetary Fund. I mean, all central banks issue money. The money that is issued by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, are special drawing rights. For clarity, the special drawing rights are essentially foreign exchange reserves of central banks. So the IMF issues them and gives them to central banks. And so there are reserves like, let's say the U.S. Treasury bonds that central banks could buy, or gold. They decide to keep gold. So that's why I think the point is, if it's a liquidity problem, the central banks can use that money. So they can either sell their U.S. Treasury bonds, let's say, sell their gold, or use the special drawing rights to pay to other central banks. That's how it works. Now, the problem of the special drawing rights is that how much countries receive depends on the capital in the IMF, which is more than 50% in the hands of developed countries, and there is also a lot of money, let's say, for example, for the Arab countries that don't need. So the money is largely not used at all. I mean, my estimate is that maybe around 90% of the IMFs are not used at all. Developing countries do use them for payments to other central banks, and particularly the low-income countries including Sub-Saharan Africa, have been using them. Now, the long-term solution is let's change the composition of the issuance of special drawing rights so that the need for that money should be one issue that should be taken into account, and not only the contribution to the capital of the International Monetary Fund. That solution may be discussed. I don't see it quite likely to be approved. Now, the other solution that is being done is, those special drawing rights that are not being used by developed countries, let's use them to lend to developing countries. That is a solution that is being partly used in a couple of funds managed by the IMF, and it could be used on a broader scale by multilateral development banks. So let's say Germany has a special drawing right that is not using, so deposit them in the African Development Bank or other development banks, and that constitutes funds that the African Development Bank can say. Now, see, the interest rate for special drawing is low. That, I think, could be a contribution to a relatively cheaper lending by the multilateral development banks.
All right. I think it was mid-2021 on the back of the COVID-19 wreckage. There was a whole discussion around we need to have reallocation, which has just been spoken to, around SDRs. Did it move the needle as far as debt resolution is concerned?
Well, the problem with the SDRs is that nobody was ever quite certain exactly what they were supposed to do. Now, when SDRs were created, the idea was that the global system was short on liquidity because of the way the U.S. balance of payments was evolving. Now, interestingly enough, just after the IMF approved the creation of the SDRs, we had a flood of international liquidity. And that's one of the reasons that they entered into difficulty right away. Nobody needed them. The other problem was whether the difficulty was really a question of liquidity or a question of solvency or insolvency is better to say. Now, liquidity means what? Well, liquidity means that you have a temporary shortage, okay? Somebody didn't pay you last week and you have to pay somebody today. So, you have to borrow a little bit of money to make good the matching of those contracts over a week or a year. Now, if you're in a position in which there is a basic change in your economic conditions, for example, go back to the example of primary commodities for a country like Ghana, if suddenly the cocoa market should disappear, people stopped eating chocolate bunnies for Easter and things like that, what would happen? If it's a liquidity crisis, the SDR is there. You can go to the IMF. The SDRs can be used in order to sort of plug the hole until the cocoa bunny market recovers. But if it never recovers, now you have a solvency problem. And the solvency problem can't be solved by the SDR solution. So this is the difficulty that you have in terms of the system that we're now looking at. In many cases, the kinds of changes that we're going to be looking at, in particular climate changes and other things, are not simply things that can be solved with liquidity. That is, if there is a substantial change, I don't know. For example, in the levels of the sea, the levels of the ocean, we're sitting here on the coast, and eventually the property that we're sitting in is going to go to zero value. Now, presumably, this generates tourist revenues. If the tourist revenues disappear, then Ghana has lost a source of revenue that is going to be permanent. It's not that the seas are going to go back down again to where they were, or at least not in my lifetime or in yours.
Yeah.
And increasingly, if you look at the climate crisis or the environmental crisis, these are changes which are going to bring about losses in income that have no counterparty. There's no revenue source. And if you undertake government measures, which most governments will do in order to compensate populations for the losses that they incur as the result of climate change, these are going to result in increases in debt stocks, which have no natural revenue sources for repayment. So we're going to have to, in this sense, rethink very much this idea between liquidity and solvency, because many of the issues that we're going to have going forward are going to be increases in what we would call technical insolvency.
Yeah.
And that is a very different issue that the IMF is going to have to take care of.
Wonderful. All right. So let's explore the impact of the debt crisis on financing for development.
Well, the debt issue is an issue by itself that has to be solved as part of the international financial architecture solutions. But there is also the other question of additional financing in issues like, for example, combating climate change. Or other issues. And in that regard, let me say that there is probably more consensus on the second than the first. On debt, for example, the G20 has been silent, essentially, since 2001. But in the case of multilateral development banks, there was some interesting proposals to increase the financing for this thing that we economists call the global public goods, which is combating climate change or combating pandemics, etc. And using consensual financing, that is, lower cost financing, longer term financing. Now, the big question mark in that regard is the money that is required for to capitalize the multilateral development banks, and then the resources that they need for the concessional part, for the lower cost financing, let's say, that these institutions will be providing.
Yeah, I mean, the problem of financing for development is this balance that we've always had inside the United Nations between the financing side and the trade side. So if you look at the beginning of the process that went on in the 1960s, the first proposals were in terms of the development decade. And the development decade came up with this commitment for developed countries to provide financing for developing countries. And this is this famous 0.7 of developed country GDP as the target. Now, that was decided in a series of conferences and resolutions in 1961. In 1964, the Latin American developing countries and developing countries in general came back and said, well, this is all well and good that you give us all of this financing, but we're basically dependent for our development on the sale of our primary commodities. And if we look at the price of those primary commodities, tendentially they seem to be declining. So we're in fact losing out in terms of the things we produce. And what we're doing is we're borrowing from developed countries in order to make up that difference. And this is not a sustainable development strategy. So UNCTAD was created in 1964 in response to that trade side. So we've always got this balance between the real conditions that pertain inside the country and the financing conditions. And basically in 64, what Braul Prebisch, the Secretary General of the first UNCTAD conference, said, well, fine, you can give us all the money you want, but if we can't produce enough in order to earn our way to development, then we're simply going to borrow our way to development. And in fact, this is what's happened. And this is why we've had these series of debt crises since that. So the problem of financing for development is to try and create the financing that produces this change in the real productive strategies and the productive sectors of developing countries so that it's no longer a question of being dependent on the chocolate bunnies that you're selling for Easter, and you're going to be selling products in which you have the possibility of increasing the productivity of your domestic labor force, increasing your ability to export, and with that, your ability to meet the borrowing that you get in terms of the external financing.
The leadership of the G20 is now under Brazil. The African Union is also now a member. What can we expect, especially around this conversation around debt?
Well, I really hope there is something more ambitious. In the India G20 statement by heads of state, there was absolutely nothing new about that. It was only the common framework, which is something that was created in December 2020 and had been used in a very difficult way by only 4 African countries with long negotiations. So it's a framework that doesn't work. So it has to be improved significantly or launch a different initiative. I think for the sub-Saharan African countries, more like the multilateral debt relief of 2005 is probably the solution. So that's in the hands of Brazil. I think Brazil is also more open to, let's say, to solutions of that regard. It's in the hands of South Africa, which is the G20 host next year, and it's in the hands of the African Union as a member of G20, and of course, it's in the hands of the United Nations for its Conference on Financing for Development next year in Spain. The 4th United Nations Conference on Financing for Development, which followed the one that took place in Addis Ababa in 2015.
Close it for us, please.
Well, basically, you've got the problem, as I mentioned before, of trying to link these discussions back down to what your domestic strategies are going to be. So we're going to look at the debt crisis. Let's say we manage to eliminate completely all of the debt. Well, we've heard frequently that many African countries have done this. Nigeria at one stage did it. They decided to pay off all the debt, and then lo and behold, what happened? Oh, suddenly it comes back. So the question is not only resolving the crisis, but making sure that these crises don't repeat themselves over again. So yes, we would like to have a very strong position on providing debt relief in order to make the short-term recovery possible, but there's also this question of medium and long-term strategies. The strategies have to be changed. Otherwise, we're going to continue to do this over and over again, and we're going to be in a position where very few of the countries who are currently in debt difficulties are going to be able to increase their domestic national incomes and their domestic purchasing power for their domestic citizens without running back into the same problems.
Thank you so much for your time. Jan Kregel and José Antonio Ocampo, who I spoke to in Ghana at the Ideas Conference on African Debt and the Global Financial Architecture. Please do check out the show notes for more details, including a link to the great presentations made at the conference. Next time on Economics from the South.
I'm really concerned about the next generations.
I'll be exploring what it means for a country when it defaults on its sovereign debt as happened in May 22 in Sri Lanka.
And if you just look at even the growth figures for Sri Lanka, it's going to be 2028 before our GDP returns to the level that it was in 2018. So we've definitely lost a decade, but it's more like 2 decades that we are looking at because there was no growth during that whole decade. Now, the social impact of that is that there is increasing unemployment, livelihoods have been disrupted, youth have no future other than to maybe migrate.
Thanks for listening to Economics from the South from the International Development Economics Associates. Please do share with your networks. We'd really appreciate it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts so that you can get new weekly episodes automatically. I'm Julian Samboko. Pennydale is the producer. The concept is by Charles Abukre and CP Chandrasekhar and Atieno Ndomo of the International Development Economics Associates. Check out the show notes for links to the Ideas website where you can find lots of really insightful articles and research papers on the issue of debt and so much more. And you can also sign up to the Ideas newsletter.